the first thing we want to talk about before we get rolling to the second part of the class today is the issue what I'm looking for. Essentially, I'm looking for something pretty straightforward that helps advance your knowledge of something, okay? For example, it could be a research project. I'm interested to see what's the likelihood that I will have Huntington's disease if for some reason my mom had it, okay? You can do basically a research paper, a term paper. Or you know what, I really want to help out with Alzheimer's folks in town, and they're doing a couple of walks, one here and one in New Bern, and just volunteer and do that, okay? Or you work at a neurosurgeon's office and you get an opportunity to see a bunch of brain surgeries, follow a handful of those patients, you know? We got to make sure that you don't hurt anybody, that they know that you're doing this and everybody's, you know, cool with it and so forth. But this is an opportunity for you to learn a lot more about something that you're interested in. I realize some of you took this because you needed a seminar at night, you know, but others, you know, may have chosen because there's a particular type of brain disorder that you're fascinated in. Well, let's do something to learn more about that. Go talk to doctors, go talk to pharmacists, volunteer at a place that has a bunch of dementia patients, you know, whatever. And then write something about that experience. That's the goal.
And so we can use first person.
Yeah, I'd rather you not too much, you know, let's say that your mom has Huntington's. I'd rather you not do that, you know, per se. You know, interview your mom and so forth, because it gets kind of heavy.
So what I was thinking was,
You get the drift?
I volunteer a lot at the Alzheimer's Related Care Center of Jacksonville. So I was
Perfect.
thinking of just like talking about both like a little bit about my experience and about the different types of dementia, because you could really see different
Great.
signs.
Or ask if you could talk to a person that has Alzheimer's, another one that has Parkinson's dementia, you know, and see if the family and the patient is willing to let you talk. And then you don't say it's James Smith, you just say it was, instead of a 60-year-old, you say 65-year-old. Instead of black, you say they're white. And that way, if I showed up at your facility, I couldn't figure out who you're talking about. Or you could focus on the caregivers of people. Or the one thing that really always fascinated me is how is it in some cases people just get dropped off and get left.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a couple of those.
Yeah, and you know, anything that really like turns you on that you'd like to know
Well,
more
I
about.
closely work with the activities director there,
Right.
who, like, we try to get activities for everyone at every level that they're at, so they're not just sitting there in their wheelchair the whole time. Like, we take some people out for bowling that are, you know, more higher functioning. People maybe a little less functioning, we'll take them out to like a restaurant so they're not just eating the food that's
Interventions
there.
used for residents with brain disorders. You could talk about art therapy, you could talk about recreation therapy, you could talk about physical therapy.
Do like a balloon toss to,
Yeah, all
Yeah.
those things are really, really useful. Okay? You guys get an idea what it is that we're looking for? All right.
Yeah.
Okay. It's good when the iPad talks back to you. Okay. All right, before I go on to the next part, I really do want to talk a little bit about theory from a slightly different perspective. Sometimes you want to put what you find in perspective, and I already shared one with you, and I want to emphasize that again. That's Luria. The triad level that you have at the beginning, at the core, real simple, at the middle, more motivational, biological, and then at the top, complex, higher order functioning. And I want to emphasize what I said already before, that as neuropsychologists, we tend to focus on those kind of problems, the higher order, as you say, executive functioning, intellectual functions, and the like, memory. That's really what neuropsychologists hang out. One of the things that it's worth mentioning, and we'll talk about it several times as well throughout the semester, is that you could also look at this from the perspective of the work of people like Roger Sperry, who was the fellow who discovered the difference between the left brain and the right brain and won a Nobel Prize for doing so in 1981. in his work, one of the things that he discovered was that the left brain is very, very verbal, logical, and analytical, whereas the right is much more visual, spatial, gestalt, emotional. You remember I was talking to you guys earlier about this kid that I had seen that was run over. One thing that was really weird is the testing results were not across the board. If somebody runs over a child with a large truck, you would expect that all the brain was affected. But there was two things that were really odd to me. As you know, the brain crosses over the motor functions. So the left brain is basically controls the right part of the body. The right brain controls the left part of the body. And one of the things that was really odd is that, in fact, we were discussing this before I talked to the attorneys, that, somebody said, Dr. Ponte, are you sure she's right-handed? And I said, yeah, why is that? Because all the motor function tests that we had done, she really didn't do well on right. It was like, oh, so they're all bad. And the left was not so bad. So the question became, what the hell? Because, technically speaking, the right is usually better than the left by about 10%. So let's have some little fun here, and then we'll do it again later semester. I want to ask you it's going to be really hard, but see if you can do it. Can you count how many times you tap, okay, in a 10-second period? Can you do that for me? Okay, go ahead. Who's right-handed? You're lefty?
Mhm.
Oh, jeez. You know what they call lefties? Sinistrals.
What is that?
Sinister.
Oh.
And it turns out that almost all the witches
Scary.
that were burned and killed, they were left-handed people. Yes.
Everybody watch out.
As a matter of fact, let's get this straight.
October.
Let's just get straight. When you try and get directions, and somebody says, do this and do that, what do you say? Right, right, right. You never say left. So you're going to hell. You're a bad person.
Long story short.
Yeah. You know what's really fascinating is that if you have brain injury, left-handed people recover from brain injury faster. Because right-handed people are much more lateralized than left-handed people. Left-handed people have much more of a diverse plastic brain, whereas right-handed people are kind of like stuck in their ways. All right, so let's do this. Let's do this. I'm going to time you. All right? 10 seconds. You ready? Set? Go. Stop. Now pick your nose. No, I'm sorry. Okay. How many did you get? Could you count that fast?
I started counting years, so
Oh.
What'd you get?
like I don't even remember.
I got like 54. I don't know if that's way too much.
No.
I was like gonna say, I got
Halfway through
too.
counting, I realized I wasn't counting my taps. I was just counting.
At one point, we all did like at the exact same.
You know what? That's a sign of brain damage. 54 is about right, okay? But hold on a second, hold on. Now let's do the other. Okay. You don't have an idea how many you got? Okay, did you? No, not really.
42.
Okay, good. Okay, now let's try with the other hand, the non-dominant hand. Okay, ready, set, and go. Stop. By the way, can you imagine somebody peeking in the window and goes, these people are taking that friggin' seminar and they're tapping their fingers? What is this? What happens when you have a hurricane? You kind of lose your mind. How many did you get?
I got 49.
Okay,
37.
okay. So roughly speaking, you should get 10% less. Okay? So you're basically, yeah, you should have a difference of 10%. Your dominant should be better. It turns out, in her case, her left hand was a lot better than her right hand. So we were all like, what the hell? This is not right. We must not have written, I did not write the handedness. So then I called the mom, just say, is she right-handed? She's right-handed. Well, okay. Then I find that when I give her memory, a verbal memory test, she blows it. When I give her a visual memory test, she's fine. You're starting to see how it all comes together? So now you're starting to see patterns. You're going, okay, right hand, left brain. Verbal memory, left brain. So then I look up the neurosurgical notes and CT scans. It turns out that she had a left basilar, oh, it's complicated, but the cranium was fractured on the left side, not on the right side. So then I looked up even further. They said that she had left brain contusion, but not right brain contusion. So then I talked to the attorney and said, look, this is kind of a weird question. You say that she had the truck run over her head. Yes. Did it run over the entire head? And he goes, no. It ran over the left side of the head.
It would have been good to know.
Okay. Well, but you get the drift of how we came to that conclusion. So you have this thing as like, she's right-handed, but she's a lot worse in the right hand than the left hand. Should be. Her verbal memory is all messed up, her left side. Her visual memory is not that bad. And on the Western Intelligence Scale for Children, performance, which measures the right hemisphere, is about 50th percentile. The left hemisphere, which is measured mostly in what we call the verbal part of the subtest, he has an IQ that's like pretty low. And you go, how could this be average and this not? How could her right hand be bad, her left hand? How could her verbal memory? So you start putting all these domains, and you go, she had a head injury, she got run over by a truck, but I don't think she got run over by on the entire brain. Is it true? Yes, only her left side got run over. And you go, aha, now you know what's going on. So that's how you put it all together, okay? So it's important to appreciate, you know, the psychometrics, all these numerical things I said, the way that Sperry thinks, the way that Luria thinks, and you bring it all together to get a clinical presentation of what's happening. All right. So, any questions about all this? I have a question for you all. Of the things that I've shared with you for the last hour or so, what's most interesting or surprising? And then we'll talk for about another 45, 60 minutes on practice.
The tri levels that you talked about, how you can have something at the base completely functioning fine, but the functional levels just off. I thought that was probably the most interesting.
That's good. How about you?
Most interesting, I thought the fact about left-handed people recovering was very interesting. And I wonder if that's something, almost like something preventative, being able to like, not that you can prevent brain injury because it's going to happen, like if it
Yeah.
happens, you know, but
Yeah.
like it's interesting that you're advantaged
If you're left-handed?
Yeah.
Now here's an interesting question. Why do we call left-handed people like bad people? Why do we call them sinistrals? Because in reality, they're much better. I don't know.
This goes back to, I think, what, Catholic Church, or
I don't
even
know.
further back than
Even
that.
those stupid desks that we all sit in, you know? They're really like, they're right-handed desks. You know?
Well, why did back when my parents were growing up, they were forced to be right-handed. Like, why
They
is
have no
that?
choice. Yeah, I don't know. We thought left-handed people were bad people, honestly.
I have family members who went to Catholic Church and they would hit their hands with a metal ruler if they used their left hand.
Yeah.
So they have like horrible handwriting in their right hand, but that's what they were forced
What's
to do.
surprising to you?
I just thought the overall case of that girl we talked about was very interesting, because she was so young, and I guess we'll see how she progresses as she gets older too.
That's a real question.
Yeah.
I hope they don't settle the case right away. Yeah, I'd like to see her in a year or two and see how she's doing. And that way I can have a better understanding of where she's headed. What surprised you about what we discussed?
I think it's interesting that when you talked about when you see patients at different points throughout their journey, like you see them when they're in the hospital and then like 6 months later, then a year, and how things progress and how, depending on what they have, it progresses differently.
And sometimes it's really a bitch when it stops progressing. Because it's like 6 months and it's like begins to get flat. And you're sitting there going, no, we gotta keep going. But then, you know, they're depressed, they don't feel like doing anything, they stop going to their appointments, they start drinking, and then you get in trouble. Okay. All right, so now we're gonna switch gears, and we're gonna talk about the practice and profession and of neuropsychology, clinical neuropsychology. And let me talk about the profession for a little bit, and then talk about the practice for a little bit. And this really goes back, I think I've talked to you about it already before, but I want to go into some more detail. If you look at the history of psychology, which I already shared with you, it's really very academic. It was male, white, and academic until about 1945. And as I share with you, when the Second World War started, we had all these people come back that had all kinds of problems, and the VA system was started. Unfortunately, the VA system did not have enough psychiatrists, and the federal government went to psychology departments and said, we'll give students money to be trained, and when they get finished, we'll give them a job when they get out. And for that matter, we'll go ahead and give you money to do research as a faculty member. The VA was a boom then, and for what it's worth, the VA employs more psychologists than any other institution in the entire world. So it's really a big deal. But eventually, all the hospitals got enough of those psychologists. We have 4 hospitals, VA hospitals in North Carolina. We have one in Durham. We have one in the western part of the state. We have one in Salisbury, and we have one in Fayetteville. Have you seen any of them, like Fayetteville or Durham? You been to Duke Hospital? There's a red brick building across the street from Duke Hospital. That's the VA hospital. And essentially, what happens is those people, you know, after a while, there's only so many psychologists you can hire, so they started going into practice. And unfortunately, there was no way to pay psychologists because you had to pay on the barrel, you had to pay cash. Insurance companies did not allow psychologists to be reimbursed. There was a guy named Bob Resnick who actually just retired, or retiring this year. It was at Virginia Commonwealth or College in Richmond at the medical school, and he wasn't getting reimbursed, so he sued together with Virginia Psychological Association, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and they said, fine, you now can bill for psychological services. That all started occurring about 1965 to 1970. Unfortunately, what happens is there was no licensing laws as well, and they started also about the same time. Just to put it in perspective, I'm licensed number 831 in North Carolina, which is, you know, it's hard to imagine that. And I know Mary Clark, who was number 1. I knew her for a number of years before she died about 15 years ago. So it gives you an idea how recent all of this is. But things started happening that just didn't necessarily allow for neuropsychology to grow. I'll give you an example of my own. I was part of Carolina Counseling Center for a number of years, just super people off of Delaney Road by the hospital. We all got together, built the building, started a practice. Dr. Ibsen, who's Dr. Galicia's first wife, Nancy Peters, who's one of the first psychologists in Wilmington, and Michael Bradley used to teach here. We all opened it up, and it was great. We had a really good relationship. Unfortunately, they were doing traditional clinical psychology, which just didn't fit. My patients were much more complicated. I took longer to do evaluations. The therapy that I did was different than theirs. It just wasn't like, it was just a mismatch. As great a people as they were, I just couldn't fit nicely into the model that they were using. So eventually I was given the opportunity to go to Wilmington Health, and Wilmington Health at the time had 15 physicians, and I was hoping that that they, when they offered me the possibility to working with them, I was hoping that they misunderstood, because clearly I was not a psychiatrist, clearly I was not a clinical psychologist, and for better or worse, I thought that they were looking for a different individual. And I said, no, 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 we want to attach something to the neurology department to try and better understand our patients, because what's happening is that we're not in a position to be able to really do justice to the kind of patients that we're seeing. So I started working there. We added 2 other neuropsychologists, and out came the explosion of neuropsychologists that we have in the community. But one of the difficulties that exists today is, who is a neuropsychologist, and what is it that allows you to be defined? Because it's not clear, because a lot of people find neuropsychology to be hot, sexy, so to speak. So a lot of people are doing it, but in reality it's not so simple. So let me tell you what it is that a neuropsychologist is, and then let's go into some detail about what is it that they do. So as a rule, to be a neuropsychologist, you have to have a doctorate degree. Now you could have a degree like my son, Nikki, who has a PhD, or you could have a degree like my daughter, Krista, who has a PsyD degree. So it doesn't really matter, but it's generally clinical degree of some sort. I don't have one in that area. My area is a combination of clinical and biopsychology, which is, I don't know, maybe either too far ahead of its time or just down the wrong road. But either way, that's how you usually do it. And then after that, you then have to have an internship of 1 year. Internship is usually part of your graduate program. And then after you finish your degree, PhD or PsyD, and you have all this training, you then typically do what we call a postdoctoral fellowship. So in the case of my son, who's a neuropsychologist, he got his PhD at Georgia, his internship at Duke, and then he did a fellowship for 2 years at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Now, once you finish getting your fellowship, then you're eligible to go and do additional training pretty much on your own for about 3 more years. So when you have a total of 5 years experience, then you can apply to become a board certified neuropsychologist. Essentially that means that you can now sit and take an exam that's written and verbal, that is basically your peers deciding whether you have enough proficiency to be a neuropsychologist. If you pass that, you're board certified. There are about 5,000 neuropsychologists in the US. About 10% of those are board certified. I failed my first board certification exam, and if you get old enough and you become a peer or colleague, which hopefully that will be the case, and you buy me a drink, I'll share with you what happened, because I think in and of itself is fascinating. I often tell people that it took the board certification process 25 years to board certify anybody south of the Mason-Dixon line, and about 30 years to board certify anybody that was not white. So who knows? The alternative is that maybe I wasn't that good. But I will tell you a funny story just to make it a little bit entertaining here as we get late into the night. And that is, 4 of us were invited to attend to the first Luria Neuropsychology Conference in Moscow. And we were there in September 28th, 1992. And 29th or 30th, I don't remember, something like that. And it was so friggin' cold. We were living and staying in the dorms. And I remember I was like freezing. But I was fortunate enough, since I know a tiny bit of Russian, to give money to one of the students that was escorting me around. I said, get me a coat, because I will certainly die here if I don't. So he bought me this unbelievable big old coat, which I still have, that I am confident could withstand Antarctica. And so I was like in my room, just like freezing, but nice and warm and toasty. And then about midnight or 1 a.m., I get this knock on the door, and it was Dr. Harold Goodglass, who was one of the 4 in the delegation that was attending this conference. Dr. Goodglass is the one that flunked me on my board exam, and he goes, because obviously we're not that friendly at that point, and he's like about 85 years old or something like that, and he goes, Dr. Puente, I need some help. I'm really, really, really cold. Could you help me find some mechanism to stay warm? And my first reaction, because I don't know if you know this or not, I'm really a deeply Christian and warm and wonderful human being. I thought to myself, die you old fart, it's your time. But something like some devil in me said, you can't let this old man die. So, to the middle of the night, went to find a friggin' blanket the guy ended up living. I'm ashamed of myself. So, anyway, the other part I have to tell you, under the influence of alcohol. So we'll have to wait for another stage in your career. So in essence, there are very few people that have board certification. In the Wordsworth category, I'm so disappointed with the board certification process. It's not on my vita, but I am certified twice. I'm double boarded. I'm double boarded in general neuropsychology or clinical neuropsychology, and I'm boarded in pediatric neuropsychology. There are very few people that are boarded, and I think probably maybe less than a few percent are double boarded. But it's so political, you know. I sometimes think that I got shafted early because I was not part of the in-group, and I think I was onboarded later because I was, you know, well known. Both are wrong, and here they are. So there are very few of us. Now, here's an interesting little fun fact. There are 5,000 neuropsychologists. Just out of curiosity, how many do you think are in Wilmington? There's 50 or so, just to put in perspective, there are about 50 or so psychologists in the community, 35 or 40, depending if you talk about full-time or tenure track people in our department. By the way, that's very, very, very large. University of Georgia, Florida, only has like 45, so we have a huge department. So 35, 40, and 50 or so, 60, how many neuropsychologists do we have? Guess.
I'm gonna go with 2.
Two? Actually, there are probably like 6 or 5. 3 of us are board certified, maybe a 4th, I don't really know. All the 3 that are board certified, we were all together, but we split up when we left Wilmington Health. And there are 2 that I have a clinic, but I've never met them. If you gave me a lineup, I couldn't tell you who they were. I don't think they go to conferences, but you know, who knows, they're out there.
What are their
So-
names?
What's that?
What are their names?
I think I already told you enough disparaging thing that if I told you their name, then you might, we were recording this, and then she'd call them up, and then I'd get sued because Colby's a bad person. I guess she would do that. Yeah, but you know, there's really like, I think 3 or 4 there of us are board certified. But that's a lot. That's a lot. Actually, I don't think Raleigh has that many, just to give you an idea. So, but it's a specialty. It's not a whole heck of a lot of people. Now, I wrote an article on this for National Psychology several years ago, and some newspaper, and here's what I said. I think it has to do with, it's very close to medicine. There's no fight within medicine for this. The reimbursement is a lot better, and in many ways it's a lot of fun. So all things being equal, it's probably the hottest area of what we might call the application of psychology. Clinical is good, health is good, school is also strong, counseling is fine, but probably the one that's doing gangbusters is neuropsych. And a different way of looking at it is, there are different divisions in APA. There's a counseling and clinical. The largest division of APA right now happens to be the neuropsych division. So it's doing very well, relatively speaking. All right, so let's take a pause and just ask you, what would you like to know about any of this, about how do you become a neuropsychologist, and then we can turn our attention for a few moments to the practice of neuropsychology.
What are the advantages of being board certified besides just
Well,
more
in
money?
certain instances, you can't get hired.
You can't get
Like, for
hired?
example, at the VA, if you're not board certified or board eligible, you won't get hired. Some hospitals, Nikki was telling me that Hopkins won't hire you unless you're actually board certified. In forensics situations where you present your case in court, being board certified carries a lot of weight. I think if you're in the community, I think people might think that you're more competent. It's not always true, but it certainly comes across as that.
Is it easier to get board certified in, say, clinical psychology?
I think
as
it's
opposed to-
easier in clinical, and although they might not say that. The head of all the board certifications happens to be in Chapel Hill, Dave Cox. It'd be interesting. Let's see. Let's see if I have him on my telephone. Okay.
You would know that.
Well, the reason, I know him a little bit, you know why? Why do I know him a little bit? Any ideas?
Is it just because of your presidency?
Dang it. Whoa. No? Yeah, I mean, that's probably true a little bit. Wow, I must have, I don't know why. His son goes here. Just-
Oh,
He was going to Alabama, and his son decided he wanted to come here, and I gave him a tour and all that good stuff, but no, he would probably agree with me, I think, but
What's his son studying?
psychology,
that's amazing.
yeah.
Because I was gonna ask, because at least 2 of your children are psychologists.
You know, there was no option.
I thought
Yeah.
all of your children were associated with
Except
psychology.
one, right?
One doesn't.
One is an economist, but, you know, in many ways, and he's a political economist, and I'm involved in many ways with political economic issues. So it's not that distant in any ways. I don't know. I mean, I never said things like, you should be a psychologist, or you should be a physician, or a dentist, or a housewife, or any, I was worried about, you know, did the grass get cut, you know?
I think a lot of people end up going for what their parents were.
I think
My
they were
parents
just
were
kind of-
both
Yeah, they were just kind of-
computer software engineers, and my sister was doing that, and they're like, you know, when I was in high school, they're like, you know, there's this class, and I was like, nope, no computers.
Yeah, I don't
I'm
really
so
know.
bad with technology, I don't know.
I don't
That
know.
just didn't get passed down to me somehow.
Maybe if you ask me that question next week when we're all here, I'll call Nikki up, my son, or Kristen, ask him what influenced him to be a psychologist. I don't know.
See, my aunt and uncle are both, I think one has a PhD and one has a master's in ABA.
That
And-
sounds very similar, applied behavior analysis.
Yeah, and now their son is like, okay, where's the best psychology programs when he's looking for colleges? And I was like,
I
yeah.
know one of the kids was thinking about finishing up just the master's. And I said, how would you feel about being the only person in the family that didn't have a PhD? So it's like, pressure.
You planted a seed.
Yeah. So what other questions come up in terms of the profession?
I had a question about like school to get there.
Yeah.
How do you feel about dual programs that include neuropsychology, but they include something else as well?
Well, this is an interesting question. Because what you're asking is, should the doctorate degree be a generic degree, or should it be a specialty degree? And specifically, should you end up getting a degree in like clinical with a small c, where you could do health psychology, counseling psychology, neuropsychology with postdoctoral training? Or should you be ready to go to do whatever it is that you want to do right after your doctorate degree? Most of us would argue that today you should get small c clinical, and then maybe with a specialty a little bit, like Nikki did. You know, he ended up getting a degree with a neuropsychologist, studying neuropsychology, but he had a good dose of psychotherapy, a good dose of psychopathology. So then you go out and train in the postdoctoral degree, and that's all you do. You don't do pain work, you don't do psychotherapy, you just do neuropsych, period. That's the model that seems to be going strong today. So, any other questions? No? Okay. I need a question from you since you're eating dinner, and I'm thinking, damn, what am I going to have for dinner?
Is this okay that I'm eating?
No, I don't think so. 'Cause I think you should share with all of us.
Need to have like
What are you
3
eating?
goldfish, 'cause that's all I
I
want.
made some grilled shrimp and broccoli with fries.
Damn, good for you. All right, so I need a question from you, since you're eating and you're full of now protein. What's the question about the profession of neuropsychology? I'll ask you. Do you see, dang, that would be not appropriate because you have not worked with psychiatrists. But have you ever heard Dr. Huffman say anything but positive about the use of a neuropsychologist?
Well, I know I've gotten to the point where some patients will call and like, you know, this could be neurosurgically related or this could be neurologically related. And I have to explain to them, you know, it could be something, you know, structurally, or it could be just, you know,
Functional.
yeah, your nervous system. So sometimes I might get my hands on a referral that we get or we send out, and they say, you know, there's nothing we can offer for them, like that he can cut them up open and
Right.
do something with. It's more about, I see these tests that, like, is it Dr. Hummel or Dr. Rommel, someone at Wilmington Health usually conducts.
No, they don't have a neuropsychologist, but it would be a neurologist.
Mhm.
Yeah, that would be a typical. It's not atypical to go neurosurgeon, neurologist to neuropsychologist. But there's no fighting, and it's all like useful information. Whereas with psychiatrists and psychologists, clinical psychologists, a little bit more of attention. Let me ask you another question. What do you think about like that long of a career? Even you, Colby, what do y'all think about that?
What do you mean?
So 4 years, then a typical PhD or PsyD is 5 years or 6 years, which includes your internship, and then 2 years after that is a postdoc, and then maybe 1 or 2 years, 3 years after that, your board certification. That's a long ass time to get trained.
I think for people who like genuinely want to go into that profession, then like they need to be trained well. That's not what I want though.
What do you think you want?
I'm getting a master's in healthcare administration.
That's right, because you've
So
talked about
I
it.
just want to go into, I just want to
Yeah.
work.
Well, next week we're going to talk about that a ton. How about you guys? Even you, Colby, what do you think? That's a long time.
Yeah, I think it's a race. I think it's political.
It's really political.
I think that we need psychologists, and I think we make it difficult a lot of times for it to happen.
Sometimes when I was going through grad school, I felt like I was like running, and there were 2 sets of people, one either side, and they were like hitting me. And then if I could finish the line, at the end they would give me a club and say, okay, you're part of us. Next person comes, make sure you hit them hard. Sometimes I felt that way when I was going through it. But then the flip side is, if you're going to do neuropsychology, and you're making a decision, like I'll talk about it next semester about some of my death penalty work. You better be damn sure that what you're doing is spot on, scientific, ethical, legal, reflecting the state of the art, because somebody's life, you know, and justice, the flip side of someone's life, is on the line. So do it right. So it's a long, slow process.
And
But-
I think I understand the reason it's so long. It's just not something that, I mean, unless you have a clear passion and this is just absolutely what you have to do, is not something I would end up doing because it's so long of a road to get there.
Well, think of it like
It's
this.
Expensive,
But
yeah.
that's okay. It, you know, comes out in the wash. You know, you'll eventually do fine. Think of it like this. There are 2,000 to 2,100 Mondays in a typical career. You better wake up every single morning and say, I am so damn lucky to be doing this. Because if you're doing this because you get paid $200 an hour, before too long, you'll go wacko. I don't care if you get paid $1 million a year or $10. If you're not really turned on by it, no reason whatsoever you should do it. So, but we'll talk more as time goes on. Okay, so what does a typical neuropsychologist do? Well, one of the things that's really fascinating is that what they do is maybe not what I thought, maybe what you thought they do. So for example, they do primarily testing. I would say neuropsychologists do about 90% of what their activity is really about testing. And maybe 10%, if that, they do what you and I may call some kind of rehabilitation. As a matter of fact, it's really curious that if you are going to do rehabilitation of a patient with brain injury, you often go into a related area called rehabilitation psychology, which is a ton easier to get into. And in many ways, really super rewarding because you're helping people get better. One of the first people that come up, the first person that came from Russia to study with me, she had gotten her master's in Russian and she came and did the rest of the training with me here and in Chapel Hill. Anna Granovich decided she didn't want to do testing. She was tired of it. So now she does just rehab. Whereas my son, Nicky, he does almost all testing, okay? Which is kind of different because you think of, it shouldn't matter, you know, you gotta do both because just because you understand someone doesn't mean that's the end. There was a guy named Bill Parker, one of the first neurosurgeons. Him and Will Fong were the first neurosurgeons in town. And I remember getting a referral from Bill Parker, doing the testing, sending him the report back, and he goes, "Why are you sending me the patient?" So what do you mean? "Yeah, you send him back. I don't want him back." "What do you mean?" He says, "I already cut him. There's nothing else I can do. He's your patient for life. I don't want him." And one of them was a woman who took out the right hemisphere, and she's still with me today, and it's been like 35 years. She comes in once every quarter. We kind of keep her rolling, moving on, and she always says that she and I are married and that we're never going to get a divorce because there's no way that she could see life without me. There's no romance involved, guaranteed on both parts, but I do things for her that she really appreciates. Like after a few years, she was living in a nursing home. She goes, "That's my day. Guess what? I'm going to get married." To whom? "John." "Okay, I tell you what, how about if I, instead of you coming to the office, I stop by there next time. And I'd like to meet John." But John was a schizophrenic. So it's like, holy shit, Carol, there's no friggin' way you're going to marry this guy. This guy's acting hallucinating. You can't be married. You want to screw him? Fine, go for it. Just don't get pregnant, but you are not going to marry an actively delusional schizophrenic. So I called the family and said, if she makes any effort to do this, we will block her, okay? And now she's got a little past John, and she's not going to think, I'm so thankful that you didn't let me marry John, because she is really, truly crazy. I was like, all right. So that's very atypical. Most of us just do testing, okay? Now, true or false? Well, you tell me. Let me tell you where neuropsychologists work. They work in private practice. They work in group practice. They work in clinics. And they work in hospitals. Which one do you think is most likely to be? What's number one? Individual practice, group practice, clinics, or hospitals?
For neuropsychology,
Neuropsychology.
I'm gonna say hospitals or clinics.
Well, it turns out that most of us work in practice. It used to be that most of us were individual practice, and now as time has gone on, many of us are now in group practices. 3 or 4 of us. Some work in hospitals. Like I told you, the biggest employer is the VA, but the largest number of people doing neuropsychology are in private practice. And what do they typically do? They see patients that have been referred by neurologists, neurosurgeons, primary care physicians. How many do you think walk off the street? Not many. How many do you think are referred by psychiatrists? Not many. By psychologists? Not many. By attorneys? Fair amount. Now, what do we typically do? And we're going to go into detail a ton. When a patient calls in, since you work in an office, what's the first thing we ask them? And the response that I want you to give me should be like tongue-in-cheek. Like right now. I forget how your tongue's stuck back there somewhere.
What brings you to the office?
Oh, no, hell no. What's your insurance?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It's terrible, but you want to do that. Now, we run a free clinic where if you're indigent, we'll see you there, okay? As a matter of fact, the last 2 patients that I saw last week were just neuropsych cases. But, yeah, insurance. Because I know Dr. Huffman is a good man, but Dr. Huffman has to eat. If he doesn't see patients with insurance, I mean, do you know off the top of your head what a craniotomy might be?
It's up there. I know kyphoplasty might cost like, what, 10,000?
Okay, so in the case of a neuropsych eval, how much do you think we should charge per hour?
Our office visit is, if you're self-pay, $370.
Okay, so a typical neuropsychologist is $100 to $250 an hour. And, which by the way, I won't tell you, but I charge forensic cases is not in that ballpark. So it's a chunk of change. Who has $370 or even $100? So you better have health insurance. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to afford this kind of service. So that's an important first step, and we'll talk a little bit about that next time. Second of all is, I want records. I want records. Please send me records. If you refer anybody from Dr. Huffman's office, golly, I don't want to go in blind. And when they come in, I try to get other records. We'll go into detail, but what kind of records? Educational records. Records from, I don't know, wherever I can get something, because that is one way to get that premorbid level of functioning that we were talking about. You remember that earlier? So let's get something that allows me to get a rough idea of what's going on. Then the interview. How long do you think an interview should be?
I guess it just depends on the situation, but
In general.
in general, there's been at least like an hour, maybe 2.
Okay, an hour, it's typical. 2 is not unusual. 3 is unusual, very unusual. By the way, should I interview you?
Probably the person who brought me in.
How about you and your mom, or your boyfriend, or whomever? Why you and your mom?
Because if I have a brain disorder, then I might not be able to provide the most accurate
Right.
information.
Or here's a good one. Why are you here? My wife brought me. Why did she bring you? I have no idea. I don't want to be here. Okay, I'm fine. In fact, I was just doing a report that I wrote down. The patient reports that they have no problem. And then I talked to the mom and said, the mom said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 things are wrong with them. So, well, why is the person not be able to report? Because among other things, they have some difficulties. So single interviews are okay. If you can interview more than once, even better. 2 hours, not so bad. And if you have the opportunity to interview more than one person, it's really useful. In a forensic case, have you ever taken any of my classes when I went to do interviews elsewhere? Last semester, I think I did that. I went to, I forget. Anyway, I was in Mexico this summer, in Guatemala, in each case for about a week, where you just go literally into the jungle to find out where these people were like. So who do you interview? The mom, the dad, the cousin, the preacher, the school teacher, so forth, so on. Why? The more information I get, the better it is. And then we do the testing. Testing is typically about 5 to 10 hours of testing, and we do the things that I shared with you. Now, I'm going to go into a little detail here, which is something that I don't think people talk about because I don't think is done usually. But there's 2 kinds of tests that you can do, in my view: verbal and visual. So, in other words, if I do one verbal test, I try to follow it with a visual test. Why is that? Because I don't want the brain to get, if you will, kind of primed. Because if I do a verbal test and I follow with a second verbal test, the second verbal test, they're going to do better than the first one because the brain has gotten to thinking about verbal things. So I do verbal, visual, and if I can, I flip easy, hard, hard, easy, easy, hard, visual, because I don't want the person to get primed. If I start thinking about wordless, and I have 3 tests in a row wordless, guarantee that by the 3rd or 4th test, I'm going to do pretty decently, even if I have Alzheimer's, because the brain itself gets primed. So I try to do a combination of things. Now, to go into slightly more detail, I also labeled my test, like test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4. If I do the morning and an afternoon session, the afternoon session I labeled A, B, C, D, E. Now, here's a question for you. Does that mean that deep down I have a serious obsessive-compulsive disorder? Anything else? Why, besides that? Besides
People
having...
think you're taking the same test if you're taking test 1 in the morning and test 2 in the
No, well, there's something like that, but here's what I do that. Because let's say that you are neuropsychologist X, and you get the patient later on, a year or 2 later, or you want to get a second opinion, you want to replicate my findings? It's there. I did test A, then test B, then test C. So you can give the same test, and theoretically, if we're given the same test, using the same administration, we should get the same results unless we're seeing you be part of a curve. And the curve is a little further down the road. So you move to Asheville, and you see a different neuropsychologist a year after, and I saw you for Alzheimer's, they see you a year later, they can give the same test in the same order, and they get 2 data points with rigorous methodology that allows them to have a clear understanding of what's going on. Or if you want to just double check my opinion, you're welcome to do that. So that's basically what happens. Now, here's a little bit of a sort of a folklore based on a small study that I published in 1996, which is, in my view, wrong, that for every hour of testing that I do face-to-face with the client, I spend another half hour away from the client scoring and interpreting the test. So there's a lot of time away from the patient that is involved in neuropsych evaluation. And here's the part that's really, 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 really tricky. And that is, we gotta integrate. Integrate. Now, this is done what we call clinical decision-making or cognitive work. And by that, I mean, we sit down and take the following. What you told me in the interview, what was being told by informant X, the records that I have, school records, medical records, and all the testing. And I begin to integrate it in a way that makes sense. What's going on? What is the disorder? What's the morbidity? What's the likelihood that the person will improve? So forth, so on. And that comes what we call the actual report. Now, the report itself is fairly long, usually 5 to 10 pages, and includes all this information in a way that is available for others to understand, and as I said earlier on, to replicate if necessary. A typical clinical case is about 10 hours, start to finish, which I do over a period of days. One day I interview, another day we test for 3 hours or 4 hours, maybe. Another day we test for 3 or 4 hours. Then another day we score it, and another day I interpret it. If I'm lucky, from beginning to end, it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Now, if I'm doing a forensic case involving workers' comp or something along those lines, it might be a little bit more in terms, the question is, did they get injured at work and can they return to work? So that may be more like 15 or 20 hours. In the death penalty cases that we'll talk about later in the semester, which is not many neuropsychologists do that, maybe about 10, 30, I don't remember, not too many. Those cases could be very, very long. I have one case where I did 10 years worth of work on the case, and the report alone, the report, not the evaluation, but the report took me 88 hours. So when you finish, you end up with a small book, in this case it's about 100 pages, which describes this guy's life in unbelievable detail. This required me to go to Guatemala, spend a week literally, being dropped at the edge of town, walking 5 miles in my hiking boots, and talking to people that lived in basically at the edge of the jungle to find out what this guy's life was like before he was injured and committed a crime. So in those cases, you have very, very long reports. It's atypical for me to see a patient more than one time for a consultation, but like I said earlier, from time to time, I do keep people on my list, so to speak, and I see them. I'm guessing that I probably have 10 to 20 patients that I do interventions on, but it's not very typical for me. Most neuropsychologists don't do interventions either, as I mentioned to you earlier on. What's a typical situation that, in terms of how practice works? You have usually a administrator of some sort, usually a technician that does testing, and then the neuropsychologist. Some neuropsychologists have multiple technicians because they really are like a farm. They just generate a ton of work, but it's very typical. The average reimbursement these days is about $100 an hour for insurance, but if you get lesser insurance like Medicaid, could be as low as $50 or $60, $70 an hour. And if you do forensic work, I think my son is charging $250 or something like that. It's much, much more lucrative, much more stressful, I might add. So this is the typical practice of neuropsychology. As I mentioned, the referrals come in primarily from physicians. You do some interviews, some record reviews, some testing, report writing, and you follow up trying to explain this to the family and to the referral source. So, very typical kind of thing. And when we get a chance, we'll go to the office and spend some time watching what is it that we do and hopefully learning a little bit more about this. So when I finished the last section, I asked you guys what was surprising about what I said. Let's go back and ask you this question as we begin to wrap it up. In terms of the profession of and practice of neuropsychology, and specifically the practice, what is it that surprised you, if anything, of what we do? Anything surprise you, Colby?
I really am curious about the premorbidity, because it really sounds like a lot of detective work to
Yes,
kind of
totally
figure out
detective work.
from
Totally
these
detective.
people that knew you what you were like, and then are your tests complementative of this?
Yes.
So I think that that's
Super
interesting
hard.
with, and the different cases too, you know, with Parkinson's and the decline, the gradual decline, and then the TBI. That's
Yeah.
interesting too.
And regarding the practice of neuropsychology, what we talked in the last hour or so, what surprised you, if anything?
I liked how it actually connects with, forensics and some politics, and, like how you said with that case you did, he was facing death penalty.
Yeah, those are the, what I call neuropsychology and steroid cases, where you're investing, I think in one case I administered 75 tests over a period of about 10 years to a patient. Yeah, after a while, you just know this person like they don't even know themselves. So the idea, you want to be 100% sure, as much as you can be. So what surprised you, Christine?
I think the ratio of testing to rehabilitation. Yeah.
Now, if you go to see Anna, who's now at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, my Russian student, she now does all rehab. But in the Wordsworth category, you are essentially in a different department altogether. And I'll call Nikki, ask him a question, but you tell me, what was the most interesting thing you've heard so far?
I just want to say probably the time, the amount of time and money it would actually take to have this, the testing done and the interviews, and then actually come to some kind of conclusions.
It's really slow
Yeah.
process. And you know what, sometimes I feel it's way too slow. I mean, from the time that I get a call from a physician to the time that I finish the testing and everything, it could be 3 months. It seems like an interminable period of time. You know, somebody's sending you to see Dr. Quinn to see whether you have Alzheimer's. We start seeing you in July and finish in October. Hell, I don't want to wait that long.
Yeah.
That's too long. What's your...
It's not surprising, but it is the amount of work that goes on afterward, after seeing the patient, and how much you have to write and really just piece everything together. When you said like the 100-page report, that kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, that's an unusual situation.
Yeah.
But even a 10, 15-page report is not atypical.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if Nikki's around. Let's ask him, what does he think about rehab? For those of you who haven't taken my classes, this is not atypical. He's not answering, that's not a good sign. Hey, what's up, Nick?
Not much, just doing little chores.
Yeah, that's good. How's Rafa?
He's good, better.
That's
Threw
good.
up some today, so I'm hoping that is what it was, but we'll see.
All right, good. I got you a speakerphone. I'm in my neuropsych class. And first of all, your son is actually a dog who's really a beast. Is that correct?
Correct.
And he's sick because he ate what?
We don't really know, but we're thinking part of a tennis ball.
Okay. Okay. All right, Nikki, what do you think about rehab psychology well, let me rephrase. So I don't put you on the spot. What did your supervisor at Hopkins think of rehab psychology at Hopkins?
They didn't say nice
Why do you think neuropsychologists don't do rehab?
I don't know, I mean, there's definitely a divide, between traditional neuropsychology and rehab neuropsychology, and, I don't really know why that stems or where that stems from. Maybe it's kind of more traditional, feel like they have different, it's kind of an elitist feeling.
Yeah,
It's less traditional rehab.
yeah.
Not really sure where it stems from. I think they feel less like they kind of do things in a less standardized and validated way, maybe.
Yeah, less scientific, okay.
Less scientific.
Hey, real quickly, because it's late in the day, what do you do typically on the day at George Washington?
I just sit around and collect a paycheck.
Does your wife know this?
Yeah, because she sees the paychecks.
You do online ordering for your groceries and stuff like that?
Yeah, I just kind of sit around and just do like, I like look at iTunes and serve checks, you know.
Yeah, I am so proud to raise you, Nick.
Yeah, no, that never happens. In reality, what I typically do, I usually have 4 clinical days where I'm working with patients and evaluating them, and they're traditional neuropsych assessments. So they're anywhere from half day to full days, and then report writing goes along with that. And then also some of that time is spent giving the results to the patient and their family.
Hey, what's the last couple of cases you saw today?
I saw a case today that was kind of interesting from a social standpoint and from a medical standpoint. She was a woman who was in her early 40s and has had a kind of rough bout with life, but trying to turn in the right direction. She developed seizures and about 15 years ago, and before they knew exactly what it was, she had a car crash, and
Oh, wow.
she unfortunately was charged with manslaughter. She started having to do some time for that, and then her psychiatric well-being didn't do so well, and so she had to adjust after that, and she hasn't really bounced back entirely yet. Started using a lot of drugs, and but she's trying to get her life back in order now. And she had surgery for epilepsy, which is what you do if they don't respond well to medications. They took out part of her left temporal lobe and the hippocampus.
And the hippocampus? Did you?
Yeah, so the standard, they did left temporal lobectomy. So what that involves, usually depending on what the surgeon's standard resection is, but usually it's basically hippocampus with amygdala and a little bit of cortex. And so it was successful in the sense of it. She hasn't had seizures in 7 years, but she's still taking some medication. And the main issue she has right now is she's not really emotionally well adjusted, still kind of depressed. Stopped using cocaine about 3 months ago, but still that's like an ongoing battle in terms of her drug use. And her memory's not good. She's not very employable right now, and so that's what brings her in.
You probably need to get her on Social Security disability.
And she already is, but she wants to work. So we'll
That's
see. I
interesting.
mean, her memory scores were not great, but I think, a job that wasn't so taxing with her memory,
Yeah.
She could probably work full time, but
It'd be really good if she can find a job and you can kind of send her to Voc Rehab and maybe they can help her find a job. And the other thing would be good if she could make less than about $10,000 a year, and that way she can feel part of something but not lose her disability benefits. So she needs to be real thoughtful about the kind of reimbursement she gets for work.
yeah, and she's working part-time right now, like 20 hours,
Yeah.
but I'm really going to encourage her to try to find a full-time job, because I think also for her emotional well-being, she kind of just sits at home,
Yeah.
doesn't do well.
Where'd you get the seizures from? That's kinda odd to get these seizures so late in life.
Yeah, I know. It was like, I guess in her mid-20s or so. I don't know. She had a head injury when she was younger.
Oh,
But, and then maybe family history, her grandma, her mom's mom had them.
okay,
So,
good.
who knows?
All right. Hey, one more thing. What's the best part of being a neuropsychologist? Besides, like getting to room with your dad at conferences?
Besides what?
Getting to room with your dad at conferences and he pay for everything.
Yeah. But,
What's that?
I mean, I don't know. I think I enjoy it is because there's several reasons. One, the primary reason I think is I enjoy trying to help people, and that's inherent to being a clinician. And then I think second too, I've always enjoyed learning and thinking about the brain and how it affects our behavior. And it's a very evolving field, so that's fun too.
That's good. All right. All right, I'll call you on the way home and we can talk other stuff.
Sounds good.
All right. I love you, Nick. Bye-bye.
Love you too. Bye.
All right.
And you can see that the smartassness was inherited.
Yeah, it was taught too.
Okay, stop, okay.
We get rid of you as a child if you don't do that. So let's call that a wrap. All right. Thank you, guys.